Greetings and welcome to Indianapolis. My name is Brian Howie, and I publish Howie Politics, Indiana. And in this capacity, I had the honor and privilege of not only traveling with Senator Richard G. Lugar to Europe, all the way to Siberia, to Odessa, to Albania, but I also had the opportunity to travel with the author who's going to be speaking tonight, and that's John T. Shaw, who's covered Congress since 1991 for Market News and has written his third book featuring Senator Lugar. I have to tell you a story that isn't in the book here. John and I followed the senator from Moscow out to Siberia to a chemical weapons destruction facility. We ended up in the renowned town of Ekaterinburg, Russia. And then, as Senator Lugar and Sam Nunn went out to the Mayak facility where the Nunn-Lugar Act has stored a lot of the highly enriched uranium that's come from Soviet nuclear warheads, John and I ended up with officials who briefed us on what the senators were going to see. Then we boarded a plane and headed to Odessa. On the flight to Odessa, we had a briefing that Senator Lugar and Sam Nunn participated in. We landed in Odessa and were met at the airport with a motorcade. And so we coursed through Odessa with sirens blaring and ended up at the Londonskaya Hotel. After a brief time there, we traveled through an area of Odessa, a very gritty part of the city, through the longshoreman area down to the Black Sea, where the senator was shown monitoring equipment that was placed on ships that would pull alongside ships coming into the harbor, monitoring, looking for highly enriched uranium. And then that night, we went back to the Londonskaya Hotel, had dinner with the senator, in which we talked about everything from what he had seen in Mayak earlier in the day to the United Methodist Conference of the United Methodist Church in Indiana. It was a wide-ranging discussion. And that night, John and I ended up in the Londonskaya bar. And it wasn't quite something out of Star Wars, but I think the motorcade and all the sirens that brought us into town piqued the interest of the intelligence community that is centered in Odessa. Ukraine is only one of 7 or 8 nations that borders the Black Sea. And as we sat in the bar, every time I looked up at the smoky figure on the other side of the bar, he seemed to be looking at me. And then there was a group of people at a table, and they started asking us questions like, where are you guys from? And who are you with? And where are you going? And we said, well, we're going to go to London. And the guy said, there's no flights from here to London. And I remember John saying, well, we're going to actually go to Albania first. And then it became apparent that maybe these folks were looking for information that maybe we shouldn't be dispensing so much. But that was one of the finer moments that I shared with John Shaw as he researched this book. And I'm going to turn the show over to him now so that he can explain the third book that he's written, this one on Senator Lugar. So, John?
Brian, thank you for that kind introduction and a little trip down memory lane. The one part of the story that Brian didn't mention is when I sort of boarded out, aren't we going to Albania next? Brian kicked me ferociously under the table, and I guess I then realized that that probably wasn't the smartest thing to be saying to some strangers. So thank you so much, Brian, for co-hosting this event tonight. And I'd also like to thank Kathleen Angelone from Book Mamas, a bookstore here in town, who is co-hosting. I very much appreciate that. I'd also like to thank Marsh Davis and his team here at Indiana Landmarks for allowing us to use this incredible facility. It's really beautiful. And finally, I'd like to thank Rebecca Tolan and Mandy Clark and their colleagues from IU Press, Indiana University Press, who've been wonderful to work with in this book project. It's really been a pleasure to work with them. What I'm here to talk about tonight is this book, which Brian mentioned, called Richard Lugar, Statesman of the Senate. And I have to mention, when I talk to people now, the first thing they ask me is, how did you time this so well? The book is coming out just weeks before one of the most eagerly anticipated primaries in Indiana in many, many decades. And the truth is, I could pretend that this was great timing, but it was almost a total accident. I've been working on this book for a number of years, and I work full-time covering Congress for Market News International. So between working a full-time job and covering a senator with a very full career, this has taken a long time to write. And it's coming out now in an interesting time, of course. The senator is involved in a very contentious, difficult primary. And I got a sense of just how charged the atmosphere here is. This morning, I went to a coffee shop, and a guy was waiting on me, and we started talking about Indiana politics. And I mentioned that I had written this book on Senator Lugar. And the first thing he said is it pro-Lugar or is it anti-Lugar? And my response is, I hope it's fair to Lugar, because that's what I've tried to do, is present a book about an important senator and describing how he goes about his work. I began this book actually in 2006. I had just finished another book, which Brian referenced, a book called The Ambassador. And I'd spent a couple years following the work of Sweden's ambassador to the United States, a man by the name of Jan Eliasson. And Jan was sort of the rock star of the diplomatic corps in Washington. He was this incredible diplomat who found a way to get tiny little Sweden on the map in Washington. And as I was finishing up that book, I wanted to find someone else who could give me a little insight into how Washington diplomacy, how Washington foreign policy worked. So I thought of course, Senator Lugar. I grew up in Illinois, and as a Midwesterner, I followed his career over the years. I've been covering Washington since 1991, and I've covered him as well. So my thought was to write not a biography, a formal biography, but just sort of a case study about how a senator can shape foreign policy. And my idea was to interview him extensively, get a sense of how he approached the job, to travel with him both in Indiana and overseas, as Brian mentioned, and also to interview some of his colleagues to get a sense of what they thought of Senator Lugar. And as far as those interviews go, I had some incredible interviews with Vice President Biden, Senator McConnell, Governor Daniels, former Senator Bayh, former Congressman Lee Hamilton, to ask about the senator. And one thing that was really striking is I talked to them and said, tell me about Dick Lugar. Almost everyone used the word statesman. And that was interesting because the frequency by which people use that term, but also given how rarely it's used now in American politics. And in the interviews, I would try to kind of probe and get a sense of what they actually meant by the term. And a lot of them didn't have real precise definitions. But as I thought about their comments and thought on my own, I sort of developed a kind of a working definition of what a statesman is. And it has 4 or 5 elements that I want to just kind of briefly present. And this maybe provides a bit of a context to talk about the senator's career. The first one is this sense of working in the national interest, the long-term national interest, an interest that goes beyond the next election. I think it also requires a willingness to take some political risks. As we all know, not a lot of people are eager to do that. A third element is a willingness to work with the other party. Perhaps that is even rarer now in American politics. Another element is a willingness to break from your own party, to disagree with your own party when you feel like they're on the wrong side of an issue. And yet another component is a willingness to work on issues that do not have a short-term political payoff, to work on programs and policies, to do good work when no one is really watching, in effect. And again, I think that's sort of a rare thing in American politics. And the final thing is an ability to actually deliver and get things done. You can have the loftiest intentions in the world, but in the end, you need to be able to deliver and to produce. And I think that's also a critical element of statesmanship. Now, in this book, I don't argue that Lugar is the perfect statesman. There are parts of the book that are positive. There are parts that are negative. I'm sure there are things in this book he disagrees with pretty strongly. What I wanted to do in terms of structuring the book was to start out with a biographical chapter to just put his life and career in some context. And the first part of that was to just describe his 8 years as mayor of Indianapolis. a very consequential time. Spent some time trying to understand the nuances of Unigov, a major